Thank you, everybody, for welcome to CCTV, Channel 17, live at 5:25, the Preservation Burlington show. We're a couple of weeks early this month because we're running live right now, right? This isn't a pre-tape.
Yes, this is
I thought
live.
we were pre-taping to run it on Thanksgiving, but we're not. So thank you, everybody. Preservation Burlington is a nonprofit 501c3 organization whose mission is to preserve and protect the historic architecture and livability of Burlington through education and advocacy. And I'd say we do a bang-up job, especially on the education part.
We try, yeah. We have a great education committee chair who is just so energetic and so passionate, and we wouldn't be where we are without him.
Right, and Bob Devino. And you've done so much for preservation community history. We were just talking before the cameras went on about you being on the show before with the Heinsberg families and the black community in Heinsberg. But before we delve into that, rein me in. You're supposed to rein me in.
There's not much to rein in, though, because we are at the end of our season. We are really getting into our planning for next year. We're actually having a nice big meeting later this week to talk about that. All our events are over. And so we're really going to, we're hunkering down and planning our re-emergence with the Bears in the spring.
But it's not sleep mode.
No.
There's so much we do homes tour. All this stuff starts to kickstart in January,
we're planting
December,
the seeds
January.
for all of that stuff.
Yeah. So all the background work is going on, you know. So where are you, before we get into anything else, where are you at in this conversation in the planning phases for the Burlington History and Culture Center?
Well, we have been spending this year, with the help of a Vermont Humanities grant, we've been spending this year holding focus groups, interviewing people, finding out what people in the community would like to do in a place like this. What should be in it? What should it look like? So we've been doing that for a year, and we've been hearing some fascinating ideas.
Can you share any?
One thing we ask people is, where should we go visit museums or other cultural centers that we could use as models or take some information from? So we have a nice list of places. We probably won't get to all of them because some of them are like in Czechoslovakia and Ireland and places like that. So
Which would be a great work trip.
would be wonderful.
I'd go. My whole family's Czech, and I can be your interpreter.
No, okay, we'll do that. But we'll go to some places, maybe New Orleans. People have mentioned the World War II Museum down there is fabulous. Montgomery, Alabama is mentioned a lot as places that we should go. So we have some places that we're going to go next year. We're going to do some of those research trips. And we've just been getting lots of wonderful themes people are talking about. They're talking about, they want to know about the industrial history of Burlington.
Sure.
They want to know about civil rights in Burlington. They want to learn about labor and labor unions and health and
Everything.
geography and geology. It's the whole kit and caboodle. And we're going to have to try to figure out how to present that.
Sure.
So where did that idea come from? So maybe for somebody who's tuning in who hasn't heard anything about it, what's the background?
Oh, yeah.
Well, a quick background is that myself and Gail Rosenberg, for a number of years now, have been creating walking tours of Burlington. And we did one called More Than a Market, and that was in the Old North End. And we did one for 5 years before the pandemic came, called a Burlington Edible History Tour.
Yep, I remember those.
And we walked around Burlington and we told migrant stories, and we ate at 5 restaurants connected to the stories that we were telling. And Gail and I were always walking along saying, where's the History Museum in Burlington? And we'd see a building for sale or that building over there, and we'd say, oh my gosh, that would make a great museum. So when we finally ended because of the pandemic, we looked at each other and said, well, maybe now's the time to try to start something. So we wrote grants, and we got the nice grant from Vermont Humanities, and so we've been working on that now. But it came from our walking around Burlington and saying, where's the museum? We do have one. It's Ethan Allen Homestead out in the Intervale.
Right.
And they're doing the history of the Intervale, and they're doing a fine job. And then there's Ohavi Zedek. They're going to be doing a nice little museum up there on the Jewish migration. So there are pieces here and there.
Yeah.
But then we're thinking we really should do the whole of Burlington,
Right.
all the migrations.
Who's drawing all those strings together?
Right.
You know, and where
Right.
do we do that? I remember when we were having our conversation at one of the one of the meetings, and you guys had suggested perhaps not one giant building or something, not one big museum, but not pop-ups per se, but but smaller thing
Right.
around in different places to reach the
Right.
community, to reach out to the community instead of having everybody
Yeah.
come to us. Maybe we all could set up in places where people would see it.
Right.
Maybe the Hula or Church Street or different places where we could tell different parts of that whole story. You know, I thought that was a really
Yeah.
exciting and interesting way to
Yeah.
approach it.
That has been suggested too by people. Yeah.
Well, that's
Although
great.
other people say, no, you really need a place.
Yeah.
We don't know. We have to find a place.
Yeah,
We have to
I
find the
know.
money for such a place.
Right.
However, we did have a talk with Eric Farrell, who's doing the redevelopment of the Gateway Block,
Yep.
where the Memorial Auditorium is. And he's very excited about this project. I mean, he's born and raised in Burlington.
Sure. Yeah.
And he's very excited about it. And we've started talking about maybe having a piece of a Memorial Auditorium. A lot of it's going to have to be torn down because it's just crumbling. But they're going to try to save the front of it, the lobby, and where all the plaques are to the World War I
Yeah,
veterans.
the whole first third
Yeah,
is what he was
that
saying.
first. So that might, they're going to try to save that. And if so, we might have a space there to do something.
That would be
Yeah.
fabulous.
But still, I mean, nothing is, carved in stone. We're all just,
Right. Everybody's just throwing ideas
we're
around.
investigating.
But the
this year.
beauty of running around like this and talking to a whole bunch of people is to see the enthusiasm.
Yeah.
There's so
Right.
much support and
Yeah.
enthusiasm.
Yes.
So, we keep trying, something will click, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's great you guys
Yeah.
are doing that and
Yeah.
pulling that together.
And we have this grant for 3 years. So, I mean, nothing's going to happen much. We might start some walking tours, might do some things like that in the meantime, podcasts maybe. We'll see. But it's a long-term project.
It's
Well,
a
you-
long-term project. You're further along than when you were way back when on that tour,
That's
talking
true.
to each other, right?
That's
Right,
for sure.
right. It happens that way. And then
Right.
honestly, with the research grant and then the traveling, the busman's holidays, I mean, research is a fun part, right? So checking out other people. I just got back
Right.
from the historic New England Summit, and it's just like a whole bunch of, I think 600 people
Wow.
virtually and in person
Yeah.
attended, and seeing what other people are doing other places, it always it invigorates me a little bit.
Right.
We get in our silos, and I think, oh,
But I do know that Elmwood was segregated when it was started. It was started, the first burial was 1790, so maybe it was started in 1790. The land was probably set aside a little earlier than that.
Yeah.
It was a 5-acre plot set aside, and the very northern part of it, this is in forest. I mean, you have to imagine Burlington at that time, there was no Unitarian church. There was, where the church stood was just forest. So beyond that, you just have to imagine it's just woods back there. And so 5 acres was set aside there. I mean, the road didn't even have a name at that point. It's been named a lot of different things. In 1790, I think it was named Locust Street, but I might not be correct about that. But it's had a lot of different names. So they set that aside. Anyone who was of color would be buried in the northern part, and closer to town would be, white folks. And the first burial in there really tells an interesting story of Vermont. The first burial was 1790. If you're standing looking at the cemetery, it's the far right corner is where the grave of Lovely Sheldon is.
That was the name?
That was her name, Lovely. Lovely Sheldon. And she came from a town called Hungerford, which today is called Sheldon, after her family. And in 1790, the Sheldons from Hungerford for the winter came down to Burlington to spend the winter rather than spending it up there. And they brought with them 5 people of color. in addition to everybody else in their household. So Burlington had about 330 people that year in 1790, and the 8 black people living in Burlington made it 2%. You know, 2% in 1790, 2% people of color. So Lovely Sheldon comes down along with her father, Colonel George Sheldon, the whole household, including 8, including their 5 called servants. But in Vermont, people of color who lived with households were always called servants, because in Vermont you were not supposed to be enslaved for life. But most of these people were enslaved, even though they were called servants. And in Abby Hemingway's Gazetteer, they talk about the Sheldons, and they talk about old Mary, who had the first child born in Sheldon, or Hungerford, at the time. So the first child, who was not a native person, born in Sheldon, was a black baby, born to Mary. We don't know anything about the father. She was enslaved, so she had no ownership or any say over her body, but she'd had this child. So all of them come to Burlington, 1790. Maybe Mary took care of Lovely Sheldon, you know, as she was dying. We don't know. It might have been one of her duties. So Lovely was buried there. But we know that probably all 8 people of color who were living in Burlington that year were enslaved. If they were below the age of 21 for men or 18 for women, they would be enslaved legally, because that's what the Constitution of Vermont said.
At the time, yeah.
Oh,
That
that's weird.
you could be enslaved until your age of majority. A lot of people didn't pay any attention to that. They
Sure.
enslaved people long after that. Or they took people who were almost turning 18 or 21 and sold them out of state,
Sure. Oh, boy. Yeah.
so they wouldn't lose their investment. But this family tells us a lot about the place of people of color in Burlington. It tells us about slavery. You know, it tells us about what people were getting support and who were giving the support, who were rewarded, who were not. So I like that. Just that little. It's a little, just a little, you know, snippet of what was going on in Vermont really early in the really early days.
Yeah,
That we were multiracial.
Yeah, of
at that
course.
time.
Yeah. I mean, I think the country largely was. I know a lot of us today, you know, myself included, are sort of proudly like Vermont wasn't a slave state, you know. But the reality was much different on the ground. And, you know, I know from what went on at Rugby Museum and different places in Vermont, you hear these stories. And I think the nation was just largely that way. It's not an excuse. I'm not saying that in a dismissive, accusatory way.
Yeah.
It's just like that's the reality on the ground then, you know.
Right. Yeah, it was. And I don't know what happened to Mary. I have no idea. She's probably buried up in Sheldon somewhere. But I don't know, and we have no last name for her. But a lot of these very early folks, the only reason we know her name is because she was mentioned in Abby Hemingway's Gazetteer. Because people that early aren't even mentioned in the census. Only the head of household is mentioned, and you get nobody else's name.
Yeah.
So it's hard going trying to find out about these folks
People,
from the real
yeah.
early days.
So Lovely was the first person buried there.
She was the first person buried there. Yep. Probably taken care of by a black servant. Yeah.
Interesting.
Who else is there? What other stories can you tell us about Elmwood?
Well, right next door to Elmwood, if you're looking at Lovely's grave, there was a church there that's burned down, since burned down. There was a house. There used to be a house there, and the people who lived there were Eliza and Tony Anthony. And they had a son named Abiel, who became a very renowned barber in Burlington. And he lived to be 99. He didn't die until 1938.
Wow.
So he lived long enough to tell stories about people on the Underground Railroad in his house. So right next to Elmwood Cemetery, there was a house and people came there for sustenance,
Yep.
you know, after a long and very traumatic journey. So they lived there. Abiel, their son Abiel, married, and he had a sister Nettie, who also married. And Nettie married into the family from Heinsberg, that there is a very large black farming community up there. And George Williams from that hill comes into Burlington, becomes a barber, becomes partners with Abiel, and marries Abiel's sister. So, and that farm up in Heinsberg has also been documented as being on the Underground Railroad. So I love this story because this is two activist black families marrying each other,
Into
right?
each other. Yeah, yeah.
And these are not, you don't hear stories about black activists, hearing all kinds of stories about white
Yeah, I
activists.
know,
and,
getting all the credit. Right.
and the white saviors coming in and saving everybody, you know. But here we've got two totally black families in two different towns, not too far apart in northern Vermont.
So where
Right.
did you
And
find this information? Where was it? Where were all these stories? And
Well, the story from Lincoln Hill, there was no story up there in Heinsberg. I did a research study on all of Vermont, looking at the census to find people of color. And after I had done that, I wrote a master's thesis on that. After I'd done that, I then knew that there was a farm in Heinsberg owned by black people, and I knew that only 4% of blacks in Vermont owned their own farms.
right.
So I said, oh, well, this will be interesting. In my spare time, I'll go up to the town clerk's office and I'll try to see if I can find out anything about them, right? Well, many, 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 many years later, still in the town clerk's office,
Yeah.
but there was so much information about them. So that was really labor-intensive, time-consuming research in the town clerk's office to uncover their story. And then I'm working with a man at UVM, Manny Whitfield, who's also researching, he's researching African Americans in Burlington. And he sent me all of these names of these people living on Archibald. And I looked at all the names and I said,
I recognize
Wait a
them.
minute.
oh my gosh, wait, a lot of those folks came from that hill farm into Burlington, and a lot of them became barbers. And barbering, there were a lot of barbers in Burlington. At one point, it was the #1 occupation for black men in Burlington, being a barber. It was a great job. You could make a really good living. And it's interesting that when I looked into these families, that their wives didn't work outside the home. They stayed in the home, as most white women did. And they owned their homes and they owned plots of land. So they were doing really well, all the barbers. So then I started looking into, what are they all doing down here on Archibald Street? So I did a lot of research on that.
And what did you come up with?
And they're labor intensive. You know, you have to go through the census and you have to go through the city directories. And then you go through newspapers.com, and then you...
It's a lot of reading, a lot
Right,
of scrolling.
and you try, so
yeah.
you're finding names, right? And some of
Yeah.
the names are relating to, other names. But how are you discerning who's of color, who's not of color when you see the names? Is it just lineage?
Yeah, no, you don't, unless, generally, it's only mentioned in the census. Sometimes the city directories might say there'll be a parentheses with COL, which stood for colored, but not always, so you don't know. You know from the census,
Okay.
if the census was correct.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a pointer
Yeah.
for
But
that.
as you said, the early census didn't have names. They would just have, laborer 1, 2, 3, and you'd have to go back and try and identify who those people even were, right? It's
Right.
not always a name.
But the census is interesting because the first couple census they had, they didn't collect a lot of information anyway, but they had the most information about white people, and then they had one column that said other. I mean, there you go, othering people.
Othering people,
Even in the
yeah,
census.
yeah.
So there's one
I
column
think
that
they
says
still
other.
have a column, other. I mean, I've seen other a lot. I'm always tempted to pick it because I feel
Oh,
like
yeah.
I'm other.
For
It's like,
some, they're asking
this,
you your
this,
race
this,
and your
this.
gender and stuff like that. You-
Other. Yeah, yeah. It says
other.
other.
But
Yeah.
this was just other, and everybody in that column was probably black, because they weren't counting Native peoples unless they were owned land or were paying taxes or something. So they were But then you start getting, they would put B for black, or N or M, and then so you have clues about that. Yeah.
Detective work, a lot of detective.
It is. It's a lot, and it's a lot of fun. I got to tell you, when you start making connections, because sometimes I'll like I was researching one family, and there was I was sure that this woman's father was. This is my proof.
Real aha moment,
Yeah.
you know, where you
I
yell
know.
out loud.
And you don't even expect to find that in land records.
Yeah.
Right.
But they did a little genealogy, and it was like, oh my God, this is
Thank you.
wonderful. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, it
funny.
really is like a scavenger hunt. And,
Yeah.
you know, when you start reading all of this stuff, at least I do, when I'm reading and I'm like trying to put all the pieces together, and then it's like, where did I see that? Like, and then trying to find that piece again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, that happens all the time.
So is your house like those TV shows where we see where people are going crazy and they're doing detective work?
And you got
there's
the,
like
like,
9 million things pinned up on the wall and in lines
God.
and strings.
No, but
I
that would
have
be
done
great.
that.
You have done that.
I have done that, but at my camp, because it was the only place I had walls big enough with nothing on them. I had big charts all over the place from different decades. You know, and then you can look and you can make connections.
Right.
I never would have been able to do that if all that stuff was just sitting
Just
on
in
my
your head or in
computer.
piles of paper on the desk or
Yeah.
something. You couldn't really do it.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, most people are visual. They really want to see things, and
Sure.
if you can see them up there, then you can start making connections.
Yeah, that's how it sticks and that's how you can make
Yeah.
those
Right.
connections. Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
when you're moving around and
Yeah. But
So-
somebody else buried in the cemetery that you might be interested in is his name is Caesar Jackson. And actually, he's buried there. He has a number 259. No stone. I can't find a stone. But he was so I looked him up, and he was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. And that's another thing I see a lot is black men who were veterans of wars, Revolutionary
in
War,
Elmwood
Civil War.
specifically, or
Yep, and they're in, no, not necessarily in Elmwood, but, you know, it would be nice if he had a stone, if we could actually find where he
Yeah.
where he is. He has no stone, he has no flag saying that he was a veteran, you know, but he lived in Burlington. He was born in Massachusetts about 1745, moves to Burlington with his wife. That was in the early days when they weren't recording names, so I don't know her name. I know his name is Caesar Jackson. I know he fought in the Revolutionary War. He has a pension. But it makes me think there were a lot of black men who fought in the Revolutionary War. They were fighting to end slavery
Yeah.
because that's what people told them would happen. Both the British and the Americans. If we win, we're going to end slavery.
Right. Which
course,
didn't
Americans
happen for
said-
another 100
Yeah.
No,
plus years.
it didn't happen.
90 years.
But that's what they were fighting for. And a lot of people, a lot of black men after the war, they came to isolated places. I think they were so disappointed and so wanted to just get away.
And start
and be
over
isolated.
somewhere where they weren't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That, a number of people, like the Prince Peters I mentioned from Heinsberg, he was a Revolutionary War veteran. You know, they're all over the place.
do we know approximately where Caesar is buried?
Yes, he has a number 259.
So that's a
So
plot.
I
You can see
That's a
on the
plot.
map, it's way up north, where there are a number of other black people there. There are black barbers up there. There's a lot of black people up, on the northern part.
But we don't know exactly which one it is.
But I don't know exactly where. It's on the little map of the cemetery.
Thinking, like, would scanning help?
But-
Yeah.
Well, probably,
rods in the ground
No.
and see if there's a stone.
or you get in there with, the underground radar.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's what I was thinking.
And you can find
Yeah.
you could find things like that. But so it would be nice. And he was probably, with a name like Caesar, I'm assuming he was enslaved, and that he probably got his freedom, fighting in the war.
Yeah.
But in white guys loved to name the people that they trafficked, Pompey or Caesar or Augustus.
Yeah.
It was ironic to them that they would give them names of powerful men. So that's why I'm assuming that he was probably enslaved
Right.
at the beginning of his life, but not at the end. And he died in Burlington. He was 83.
All right.
lived to a ripe old age.
Of 83. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is like endlessly interesting.
We could be here forever, but we
I
don't
know,
have time.
I know.
We're
We're running out of time, but because see, if we tape, we can run on and on and on and chop it up into multiple episodes.
We'll just have to
But-
have Elise back.
Yeah,
because this
no,
is
I really,
fascinating.
You can come to the cemetery sometime.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. I want to
We
do
can
that. I know
actually-
Bob's a huge fan of that one, and we can,
Yeah.
walk around and get some
Yeah.
radar stuff going
Yeah.
on. I think
Yeah.
it's so interesting. It's so fun to pull these things together, and then that you enjoy it so much, you know. And that I found out you do have one of those crazy walls where you can
do.
put everything together.
I have pictures of it.
You do. I believe it.
To
I
prove
believe
it.
Thank you for coming on the show and sharing all this stuff.
Well, thank you for
And
having me.
We'll
Fun.
continue to, Preservation Burlington and myself and all of us try to collaborate as much as possible on your adventure of
Great.
seeing whatever
Yes.
whatever else is out
We
there.
need a lot of help.
We do. I know. It takes a lot of hands.
It's a village.
It does.
Yeah.
It takes a village.
The village.
It does. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. This maybe we'll rerun it on Thanksgiving, our normal slot. But thank you, everybody. CCTV live at 525, Preservation Burlington. For more information on Burlington history, our tours or events, or to get a marker for your house, which I'm seeing all over the place now that I'm looking for them again, go to preservationburlington.org, and we'll see you next month. Well, we're going to
Yes.
pre-tape something.
We'll see you next month.
We'll see you next month. We'll be here heck or high water. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Elise.